Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Terry Marcus. I will be your moderator this evening. I'm here with Laura Wisely. She will be running our chat box. And Brian Vivret is doing everything technical tonight to make this all happen. As you may remember, if you took part in the first and second sessions, the point of these presentations is simply to learn about Route 1. The first session was geared towards the early history of Route 1. The second session focused on more recent efforts to revitalize Route 1. And in this third session, we hope to learn more about what future opportunities and challenges exist along the corridor as we move forward. I'm sure we won't have any issues, but just a reminder that these sessions are not meant to be political in any way, and discourse will be respectful and civil. Tonight's virtual format is rather informal, but to keep everything running smoothly, presenters, you're free to leave your mics on or just when you are presenting. And audience members, please mute your mics. Video, of course, is optional for audience members. The presentation is designed to take approximately 45 minutes, with 15 minutes allotted for each of our three speakers. At the end of the speakers, we will have a question and answer session to follow up. If you do have a question that comes up in the course of the presentations, feel free to put it in the chat box and we will come back to it. We have three speakers here tonight. Our first is Lisa Markovitz. Ms. Markovitz is president of the People's Voice, the civic political organization here in Howard County, whose goal is to inform all of us citizens of issues going on in our local government here. She is also a columnist and has been a community advocate here for several years now. Our second speaker is Mike Smith. He is a developmental consultant. In the past, he has led the effort to bring Amazon to Montgomery County. He is a proponent of sustainable development and ensuring that infrastructure keeps pace with development. Our third speaker is Megan Bacco. Ms. Bacco is the Director of Communications at Preservation Maryland, which is one of the nation's oldest and largest historic preservation nonprofit organizations. Since 1931, the organization has aimed to preserve Maryland's heritage and has had several significant successes along the way. And Ms. Bacco, God, I did it again. I just wanted to apologize for my improper pronoun there. But I wanted to thank all of you for being here tonight and presenting and helping educate the rest of us. So without further ado, Ms. Markovitz, you are first.
Hi, thank you, Terry and Laura and Brian. I really appreciate you asking me to join you and for hosting these sessions that are really important. We have a lot of new countywide planning issues that are going to be taking place really soon that have far-reaching effects. And so what to do in advocacy in the future is a really important foundation of what we're talking about. I'm going to go off on some details of things that affect zoning issues and the revitalization plans and desires for Route 1 first, and then talk at the end about advocacy and what those future issues are that are coming up in our county where we're going to want to see as much input as possible. So I do have a presentation that I'm going to pull up, and bear with me a second. It's almost more to keep me on track than for you. But so Route 1 Howard County, challenges to revitalization. Obviously, there's been a lot of interest in high density and what that means and where it should be. APFO is always a big factor in these discussions. Affordable housing is always a big factor in these discussions. We obviously really wish that there was more innovative land use planning, and end up talking about where we should increase input. So what is APFO? I was asked to talk about APFO. I was on the APFO task force years ago, and it stands for Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance. What that means, it's a mouthful, is it's basically a law that regulates development, such as when it can be halted for a temporary amount of time if a school area is deemed over capacity, There are 3 tests in APFO, and one is allocations, the second one is schools. I'm not going to talk about the roads one much because that's more of a mitigation issue between the county and the developer. It doesn't really affect timing. But you will see oftentimes when talking about zoning issues that APFO has these wait times that are being purported to be delaying development for a really long time, and that just really isn't quite the case. So I wanted to point out some details about APFO tonight so that people can speak in an informed way about what APFO really does do and does not do with regard to delaying residential development. So there are 3 tests in APFO. The allocations test is uh, in the general plan, Howard County 2030, there are regions of the county that are labeled and defined in a certain way. And each of those regions has a maximum number of residential units per year that can be built. And I'm going to move over to this map. This is part of the Plan Howard 2030 plan, um, page 69 of that plan. This is a map of the county. As you can see, it has different notated regions and labeling of regions. The Route 1 corridor is mostly what's labeled a growth and revitalization area with some other established community areas in the more northeast area there of Route 1. And what that means is that growth and revitalization has the largest number of annual allowed added residential units that developers can create in a year. Used to be 1,200, now it's 1,000. There was a $200 swaparoo that happened about 2 years ago. This used to be 400, now it's 600, the established communities. And what that is the maximum yearly number of residential units that can be made in the entirety per year of the notated region, right? So just letting you know where that comes from. So currently waiting for allocations. I call allocations a secret sauce of planning that's never used, and it's depressing that it's never used. Every year, the county council will pass legislation that includes that chart that I just showed you each year, saying how much each region can do. And if they were using it as a planning tool more, they could incentivize certain areas by having more allocations in one place than another. They could rearrange those amounts. They don't, they always just get passed pretty much as is. And there's no wait for them, even though the wait is unlimited for them, which is amazing when you think about how often you hear people talk about property rights. It is true that the allocation wait remains unlimited, but there is no waiting on it. That's why there haven't been complaints about it, because there's no wait, which to me, that sort of means they're too high because nobody ever has to wait for them. So then when a project gets that allocations, which like I said, is immediate, they then take the school test. And I'm sure probably you're all pretty much familiar with what the school test is in APFO. A capacity chart is passed every year by the council, made up by the school system, that shows capacity limits for all of the schools. If an elementary school is over 105, middle school over 110, high school over 115, if any one of those things occurs in a development area, the project is paused. And because the allocations test is automatic, and then they take the school test after that, they pretty much in their first year of this testing take the school test twice, because they take it when the capacity test is passed as well as right away after allocations is had. So then what happens with a school test? In the fourth year of the test, they automatically proceed, regardless of how crowded any of these areas are, any of these school capacities are. And a little known fact is that the Department of Planning and Zoning, DPZ, has a general processing time for projects without having to even get any changes in zoning, maps, laws, anything, waivers, anything. This, the regular amount of processing time is 3 years. This is a known and expected wait that development projects have to build into their plan. And this time actually runs concurrent with most of the school halting time. So when you hear things out in the public from the building associations or the development community and the supporters, they talk about this APFO terrible they call it a moratorium. They say that it's closing down all development, that we're losing all kind of money from it. It's really not true, because the school, like I said, this waiting time runs concurrent with the regular processing time they already expect. If you extrapolate how much time is solely due to school issues, it's less than 2 years. Zoning challenges that I'm seeing on Route 1, with really wishing there was a little more emphasis on revitalization than growth in this growth and revitalization area. Kind of got the growth covered. How about focus on revitalization now, right? Getting some feedback there, sorry. So historically, you are aware, I'm sure, that there's been a lot of high density on Route 1. There was a goal of mixed use for a long time, and that didn't really succeed with commercial goals and actual transit access area growth goals. And things that are coming up that are going to be big changes is the county had previously done a development regulation assessment. I was on that steering committee. It was a year of work, and Clarion was a county contractor who was, I was worried how productive it was going to be, and I was pleasantly surprised that they made some really great suggestions. They liked the idea of focusing on character-based zoning, which I also saw as a focus in the Route 1 master plan. Neighborhood zoning, character zoning, having that in with the industrial and commercial aspects as a focus of how to revitalize things. And that was a mutually held goal of Clarion in this development regulation assessment that was done in 2018. But then after a year of work and 700 comments from the community on the county's survey with regard to that process, it was shelved. And it was shelved because it was in 2018, and it was considered something that was too much going to be handled in the next comprehensive rezoning. And they wanted to do a general plan update before the next comprehensive rezoning, so everything got pushed forward. And the concern there is that the general plan really does inform a lot of what the county does in land use going forward. And the goals that were had with that regulation assessment had some really commendable goals. They talked about not increasing density beyond the underlying zone in areas such as, if you choose to do age restricted, you shouldn't automatically have a ton more density than the underlying zone. They made a lot of examples about floating zones that had too much customizable rules and wanted to do away with those. They really were focusing on character-based zoning and protecting environment and historical resources. And we just want to make sure that those goals that were so commendable in that previous assessment work carry through the general plan update that is in the process now will inform a lot of the next thing, which will be the next comprehensive rezoning and zoning regulation rewrite. That will all be dominoes going forward. There is a housing task force right now, and I believe that they're going to probably very much affect some of the goals that are going to be in the next general plan update. So I watched some of their meetings, and in their meetings, you know, they have a very commendable goal of trying to figure out how to get more affordable housing supply. And one of the things that is frustrating in doing this work for 10 years now is that affordable housing would be supplied more, it would be spread out more if we stopped allowing fee in lieu of developer projects to pay to get out of providing it. And so if we just stop doing that, it would be spread out more. Another lovely thing that would happen if that occurred is that we would be able to we would have income diversity in neighborhoods if that were the case. And that would mean we could go to neighborhood schools without being criticized for wanting to go to neighborhood schools. So there's a lot of effect with these things. Advocacy opportunities here. Development is profitable is an assumption that's being made when we're concerned about having restrictions and taking care of environmental, historic farmland, trying to get infrastructure paced better. All of these goals, even supplying more affordable housing, all of these goals are needed. We need restrictions and we need rules on development to accomplish those goals. And the assumption that all development is profitable is one that's out there that, it needs a little myth busting, because when our infrastructure is up to date and we can supply people the public services we should be supplying, then it's true, development is profitable. But that's not the situation that we're in. The situation that we're in is that our public safety, our health provisions, or fire, police, those aren't even in APFO. And all of those are very expensive things with bringing in new people. And we have to, even the things that APFO does help with, schools, that's a very expensive thing to try to keep that school quality issue for our county. So development is profitable is questionable. APFO halts development too long, kind of went over why that's not really true. APFO halts affordable housing. APFO exempts affordable housing from the schools test, so that's just not true in one sentence. We need high density building to get affordable housing. Well, affordable housing isn't required in a lot of places, and it's certainly not required by much, maximum of 10-15%. The bigger the density project is, they usually get it lowered, sometimes as low as 8. So I'd like to kind of see a little bit more required, and not just have to be happy with the crumbs that we get of affordable housing in these high density places. How does that all affect revitalization for Route 1? Well, we need to see more innovative land use opportunities. We need to see things like taking areas that are blighted, or areas that we'd like to see some uses reinvented, like motels and areas down Route 1, and instead of just always having the plan for updating things be, let's throw in high density residential units, let's look at some of the older plans that had some really nice depictions on there, like having community areas of true mixed use and walkability, and actually save the high density stuff for what's really near and accessible to transit. In Ellicott City, we've actually have something in its infancy. I don't know if you're familiar with where Brown's Motel is on Route 40, but on Route 40 and Route 1 are growth and revitalization areas, right? And there is a project in its infancy that will need a zone change to try to have some of these older motels that really aren't making much money, and that they can get the owners to be willing to sell now, especially now, right? And change the zones there and do some renovation there. And they're talking about maybe having a campground situation there because it's so close to Patapsco. That would be a conditional use. So luckily there would be hearings to make sure that other places it actually would be a good improvement and a nice thing to have. But that's just an example of some innovative things that we need to start thinking about. And we need to understand how to myth bust some of these concerns and to make the community interest over the special interest, so that we can have opportunities and examples of improvement things that can move forward, and not just have the answer always be making new residential projects to revitalize Route 1. So I thank you for your time, and hope I didn't get in the weeds too much, but any questions I'm happy to have. I put our site down there. That's the civic part of the work that we do. And on that site, there's contact information if you ever want to get some more information from me. And I will, while we're going through later, I will put some links in the chat box for some of these things I referenced, okay?
Okay, thank you so much, Lisa. That was very informative, and I agree with so much of what you said here tonight.
Thanks.
Okay, our next speaker, Mike Smith.
Yeah, I'd love Lisa to keep that that slide back up on the deck there. I think that was a very helpful frame for my discussion. The most important thing, I'm a real estate developer.
You want me to keep this one?
Yeah, that one would be great.
Okay.
A little more history just from me. I was a founder of an organization called the Ellicott City Residents Association way back when, with a gentleman named Mr. Berkowitz, who lived at the time on an adjacent street to near where I live. So I have a lot of history in the Ellicott City world, less so on the Route 1 Elkridge world. So some of what I will say and speak to addresses my history here in the downtown area of Ellicott City, but I think it's consistent and helpful just to understand from a developer standpoint. The most important thing a developer looks for is certainty of rules and regulations. And there's always, every few years, every 4 years or so, a cycle on APFO where we reopen the can of worms that is APFO to see how it's working, how it can be tweaked, how it might be adjusted. And as developers start to look forward, we just like to understand what the rules of engagement are. So that's probably the most important principle throughout the whole cycle of the development game. You know, what are the rules? Are the rules changing? How do we address them? How do we incorporate the new rules and the concepts that we're trying to affect from a land development standpoint? So certainty of rules is probably rule number one for me. Second rule is that planning needs to be nimble. I think with COVID, particularly now, we are revisiting the whole way we live, the whole way we interact with each other. The fact that we're doing this in this Zoom setting, I think speaks very broadly and openly to the challenge we face today in trying to do things together as a group. And much of real estate development in the last 20 years has been about bringing us together as communities and neighbors that have shared experiences and have shared platforms where we engage with each other. And that whole process, that whole thought process is being challenged quite aggressively right now. When you think about the galaxy of land uses that are out there, I want to name 4 or 5 of them right off the top of my head that frankly are extremely challenged right now as land use concepts. Lisa mentioned hotels, and glamping might be a way to evolve a hotel footprint, which is a motel footprint on Route 1. I'm familiar with the asset that Lisa mentioned, where you might do a glamping approach, camping approach to try and evolve a hotel footprint that frankly is in search of customers that feel comfortable being in a hotel environment. The office market is sideways. I was on a phone call earlier today where a company in New York has decided to close their offices permanently and have all their employees, a small firm, probably 75, 80 employees, New York-based, Bethesda-based, an investment advisory firm. Everyone's going to work from home permanently. That's it. We're done with trying to be in a high-rise environment, elevated environment, you know, where people are being forced together uncomfortably today. So the office market to me is going through massive changes and reconsiderations in terms of how we bring people back together. The retail marketplace, the restaurant marketplace, I think we all understand what's going on there. Big challenges. You just have to go to any retail environment today and there just isn't the customer base, you know, accessing those footprints anymore. Again, concerns about COVID, concerns about being around each other. Anything of a high-rise use today, and mid-rises probably fall in this world as well. The elevator experience, where elevators, the whole concept of putting people together in a little rectangle and moving up and down and then moving laterally once they get to a floor. And then the touching experiences you have through that whole experience, moving into a building, moving up a building, and then into an office environment where you're touching different surfaces. There's a great deal of science and research that's being done now to sort of create environments where the touching is less direct and can be considered safer. So what's left? When you scrape away all those things I just mentioned from a real estate development perspective, housing is just off the chart hot right now. I mean, any form of housing in just about any place, particularly away from urban environments, is just the thing everybody's talking about. And we've used the word industrial in the context of this meeting today. I want to get away from industrial. Industrial still seems to be a pretty safe place for development and investment these days, but it's really about sort of that last mile delivery service. It's about flex distribution. It's really a very different form of industrial use. Those are the 2 sort of land uses that I still see being of great interest. Condominiums, multifamily housing, single family housing, attached, 2-over-2s, if you will. All forms of housing still seem to be resonating quite well, particularly away from urban environments. We are focused on creating walkable, connected neighborhoods. That is the future. That has been the recent successful past of what developers have been able to develop. We need to create places that endure, not only viruses, but endure around things we want to be near. We need to be focused on transit linkage. This whole car-based culture that we have, I'm a big car guy. I love automobiles. I can talk about cars all day long, but the whole planning process has evolved around automobiles. We need to de-link transportation in the way that we've historically enjoyed it and embraced it over the last 50 years from the way people really want to live today. As we move into electrification of vehicles, they become very different forms of transportation than they have historically been. And we need to have a planning process that really embraces that transformation and encourages that transformation as best as we can. I like to call it road dieting. When we think about roads, We have to think about the concept of putting the whole road infrastructure concept on a diet, because we need to get away from the road-based planning process that we've just been hostage to for decades. So we like to develop in very urban locations where there are walkability, where you have access to services, you have access to schools, walkable distances, neighborhoods are linked one to the other, so that there's a community that's being formed. And it's a place where people, I think, in the post-COVID world will continue to embrace. We need something called attainable housing. We focus on affordable housing all day long. There's a huge community of advocates out there for affordable housing. We obviously need to do more and better at it, but we need to really focus on attainable housing. And that, to me, is a demographic that I'm no longer part of, unfortunately, but 25 to 40-year-olds who are trying to find their first home or their second home, that starter home. We need to encourage that household formation and encourage those people to stay in our communities, become part of our schools, the PTOs, the PTAs, just invest in our communities and grow with us, grow old with us. We want you here. We want to keep you. We can't shut that demographic out. Bigger isn't better. But we need to get back to neighborhood scale development. That is the key. I think that's where you're going to see money and the investment community flow. That's where people are going to get excited about investing capital in real estate again. The bigger is not always the better thing to do. Schools, recreation centers, retail, office, those notes that I talked about earlier that are really struggling in the marketplace today, in time with the virus being solved at some point or some degree of comfort, all those land uses become active again, but they're going to become active in a different way than they have in the past. We're going to learn a lot of hard lessons from this experience, and we need to apply those lessons as we look at land use and compatibility and putting people together. We have to embrace diversity. We need to align racial equity as best we can, the racial equity goals with land use policy, so that these things aren't dissonant. They're actually speaking to a common theme, creating places where we're all welcome, not just some of us. Lisa did spend a fair amount of time on the APFO process. You know, the APFO process to me is about timing and getting access to the right to develop land. And we have to make sure infrastructure is there, available, that supports the development we have. There are a variety of tools that people use regionally, and I need everybody to take a look around us: Montgomery County, Prince George's County, Frederick County, Washington, D.C., Fairfax, Arlington, Alexandria, places where I do business. The rules of engagement are a little different across these borders, but we need to draw on the lessons that we see other places embrace to see if they have better ways, better tools, not only just in this region, but elsewhere, to meet infrastructure needs, because this is not just a Howard County problem and challenge. It is one that pervades this region and probably pervades this country. We need to keep pace on an infrastructure standpoint with the growth, because let's face it, and I have to admit to this, growth is inevitable. You know, we have to embrace it. We can't fight it. We can't prevent it from happening, but we have to just channel it and make it happen in ways that meet everyone's needs and objectives. So I'll stop there. I can keep going. I've lost track of time, so forgive me, but I really appreciate being asked to be part of this discussion tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. That
And
was
hello,
very
hello,
helpful.
Liz Walls. Hi, Liz. Oh, well, Liz just asked a question about glamping. Hey, spend a little time online, look the word up. It's pretty hot on the West Coast. It's pretty big in Maine, which, you know, isn't that far away, 12 hours from here. It's a whole concept of camping, and it's sort of bringing the urban experience to a campground. It's a little kind of, I don't want to be too negative about it, but demographically, it's not as accessible as I'd like it to be for regular folk. But it's the way perhaps to embrace camping in an environment near a state park, which would be a pretty cool, I think, adjacency to have. To embrace that idea, I think is really, really an interesting thing. I don't know if anybody here has gone glamping. I've not done it yet. I'm a camping guy from being a kid, Boy Scouts and all that. So glamping is a little more, much more evolved, safer form from an infrastructure standpoint than traditional camping with a tent. But check it out. It's pretty cool.
I've done both myself, and they both have their interesting challenges, but enjoyability.
Thank you, Terry.
Okay, all right. Are we ready for Megan from Preservation Maryland? Go ahead.
Sure. All right, so thank you very much for having me. My name is Megan Bacco. I'm the Director of Communications at Preservation Maryland. I do believe some of my colleagues probably have met you several times, likely in terms of either our smart growth work or our work in Ellicott City. I also, one of the first people I met when I moved to the DC, Maryland region from Buffalo, New York, was Aaron Markovich. And so if he's not the right person to show you down Route 1 over the past 5-6 years since before he moved to Connecticut, spent a lot of time in Hyattsville and Greenbelt and places like that. And so in putting together this brief presentation about preservation and revitalization programs that Elk Ridge might be eligible for, thinking through my time on Route 1, and it was an interesting endeavor, and it also made me think that there's several programs that really come to top of mind that might be interesting to you all. So anyway, so I'm the preservationist, so I'm going to start with the historic districts. Although not all of these programs that I'm going to speak about do you have to be a historic property, or do you need to be officially listed in the National Register? For instance, you could be part of a heritage area, or Maryland Historical Trust, who's our state historic preservation office, might decide that something of local significance is also of state significance. So just right off the bat, some of these programs, you do not have to be an officially listed property. That's not to say there's not value in doing that. I think especially if there are projects where people want to do kind of a large catalytic adaptive reuse project, starting by getting that on the National Register is a great first start because it opens up the tax credits. But I don't think, from what I learned from the last session, kind of about the history, Elk Ridge is an interesting kind of main street, right? It's a very transportation-based main street. So there are a couple options that I see for taking a look at the historic structures of Route 1 in a different way. I don't necessarily think a historic district is going to work for like the length of it, just because there's so much diversity over the course of it. In putting this together, I was thinking about multiple property documentation forms, and that's just a long way of saying historic districts that are not contiguous. So if you have resources, especially industrial, semi-industrial resources, where the parcels of one business are all related, but they're not necessarily adjacent, it's a kind of a thematic way to think about historic districts. So I've kind of been thinking about that when I was putting that together. Obviously, you all do have National Register districts. So there's Lawyers Hill, there's Elk Ridge Landing. And then I found two interesting things, which would be, there was a survey done of properties in Old Washington Road, and there is a potential historic district related to the B&O a little bit further south along Route 1 than you are. So there's definitely some historic districts nearby to think about. National Register districts do not necessarily offer any protections. You can demolish a building on the National Register. Most programs that have the most teeth are local landmarks, because they're directly related to an ordinance where there's regulations, there's somebody keeping an eye on something, right? So if it's something, if a permit comes in, that's kind of where the local landmark status or historic district will come in. But in terms of National Register, you're not going to get that. Anyway, one thing about being in a National Register district is it does kickstart some federal processes about federal money being used. So I won't go into that great depth in that, but even as the preservationists, I think there's other programs here that are pretty well suited for you all. If you are in a historic district, and I think it speaks to a lot of the residences. If you are in a historic district, there is a state tax credit program that you can be taking advantage of. When I worked in the state tax credit program in New York, I worked on putting a pretty large district onto the National Register, specifically so that people could access the state and federal tax credit. So that's definitely something that if we can get our hands on a mailing list of the people who are in a historic district, does this help with affordability? You have to spend, I think, at least, let's see, you have to spend at least $5,000 and they have to be approved expenses. That's not to say that that's not obtainable by many families, but it isn't quite an affordable program itself, but certainly something that people who are taking care of their homes should know about. And these tax credit programs are all administered through the Maryland Historical Trust. More specifically, I think the small commercial tax credit is a great idea for Elkridge. I will just read these because I don't know exactly all the regulations from Maryland Historical Trust. But for commercial rehabilitations, they are defined as projects that do not exceed $500,000 in total qualified rehabilitation expenses and are not used for more than 75% residential rental purposes. The credit is capped at $50,000 in a 24-month period and must have a minimum of $5,000 of eligible expenses to qualify. The program itself is capped at $4 million worth of tax credits available per year. I actually think that might be a different tax credit program. But anyway, this is an example from Hyattsville. I don't have a lot of examples of small commercial. I think this is a great one. I think all of these motels that we're speaking about, I think this is a great program for that. And that link is through the Maryland Historical Trust. And the Maryland Historical Trust not only regulates all these, or I should say administers all these, they're also the person to call to say, am I eligible? This is what my project is looking like. Or they have real quick PDF downloads that, you know, can be dropped off or mailed or sent to the business owners or things like that. So there are a handful of resources for the small commercial. If you are thinking of one of those more kind of catalytic projects, these are some examples. I pulled some examples of some pretty everyday buildings to get a sense that this is, even these structures, in terms of getting on the National Register, can be about the importance of the business. It can be importance of, especially in this case, the form of the building, the function of the building. This is Glenelg Martin. It was built that way to serve an industrial purpose. So these don't have to be like architecturally, you know, what we immediately think of as like architectural treasures. And this grant program has been used across the state. There's great projects in Canal Place in Cumberland. There's great projects, the Phillips Packing Plant in on the Eastern Shore. So this is definitely a program that Preservation Maryland spends a great deal of time advocating for, to make sure that the per project cap is raised and that the overall tax credit that's available per year is raised. Right now it's a competitive program, and the entire, the state has $9 million to give each year. As a reference point, Virginia, their cap is 100 million. Okay, and again, our cap is 9 million across the state. So there's a lot of work there. My colleague Ellie Cowan does, and Nick Redding, of course, our executive director, does a lot to advocate for this program. Every single report you can point to says that this has great ROI and everything. So that's something that, as a statewide, I wanted you all to know that we're working on that, and hopefully there are some overlaps in your historic districts and maybe some projects like that. In all of these projects, some of them, you know, certain things are going to be eligible, and certain things are going to be very ineligible, right? There is the concept of still taking care of the structure and having some character defining features. Interiors are a little bit more difficult. You're not going to get the tax credit for certain landscaping or appliances or things like that, but certainly taking care immediately and rehabbing a building, you are. The Maryland Historical Trust also has other programs. So we use these a lot for our public history projects. And I just wanted to point it out because they also have a capital grant program and a non-capital grant program. This is in addition to the tax credits. So something like the non-cap could even be used to research a specific kind of historic thematic topic or a neighborhood, or do survey to identify the resources that we think you all might have, but we're not sure how they fit into a district, or if they don't fit into a district. They also have loans, and they also have a specific African-American heritage program. A couple of things that came to mind about Elkridge and revitalization opportunities would be Main Street. In your case, I can't think of another Maryland Main Street that kind of looks anything like yours. And it is Maryland Main Street. What I would suggest is going straight to Main Street America. Main Street America has a great amount of resources. You do not have to be a member. You do not have to be a member of a Main Street. You can just join. I attend their webinars. A lot of great concepts about revitalization with that focus on business, which I think is where Main Street's toolboxes and toolkits is the right mix of development and preservation and business capacity building that really, I think all of those things overlap in Elkridge in a way that, you know, other historic communities, it doesn't necessarily. So I really suggest going straight to Main Street America and checking out all their resources. They have a great map about all their locations, and I didn't have time, but I was thinking, okay, what other, I think on the last call, somebody mentioned like Route 66, like what other, are there other main streets in other states that are more similar to Elkridge than they are to anything else in Maryland? And I was thinking, if I had a little bit more time, or somebody else can jump in and search that. But again, I think a good program. You all, of course, some of Elkridge is in the Patapsco Heritage Area, so there's the mini grants that people can apply for. Certainly, it seems perfect for small groups who are, you know, looking for a little bit of financing. So it's not just coming straight out of everybody's pocket, especially as projects and small groups and coalitions come together. And I know Lindsay Baker did a great job. I have not met the new executive director, but perhaps some of you have seen him around town. Being part of the heritage area also opens you up to access to much larger grants through the Heritage Area Authority. So as long as you're in that state heritage area, your state heritage area can then apply for these larger grants. So I just want to read this just so I make sure I get the right amount here. So the larger grants up to $100,000. I just pulled out a couple from the last batch that were announced, I think, this summer. And that whole program this year across the state awarded over $5 million. So Catonsville Rails to Trails, Friends of Patapsco, and then a project in North Brentwood that I know Neighborhood Design Center focused in Hyattsville and on Route 1 is working with Anacostia Trails Heritage Area. So again, getting on the radar of the Heritage Area Authority, not just your individual heritage area. And then I frankly don't know if that opens you up to more national heritage area funding. I think that trickles through Maryland Historical Trust and funds these grants, but again, I don't know. But again, a great resource. I think I only have two more, so stick with me here, and I can share this list with anybody who's interested in these links for sure. One that came up, I don't know if anybody's familiar with the sustainable, I can't see the chat, so I don't know, the Sustainable Communities Program through Maryland DHCD. So, which I got the acronym there wrong. In looking at this program, I just did a quick search. From what I can tell, Elkridge is in a priority funding area. You probably all know this, and may be eligible for this program. The other sustainable communities in Howard County are Ellicott City, Long Reach Village, and North Laurel Savage. And then of course, some in the other counties that surround you in Baltimore and Anne Arundel. So what I found out about this program is, since you all are in the priority funding area, it does open you up to community legacy funding and also strategic demolition funding. So, and right on the front of their website, without having to do anything else, they had a really great just quick, that revitalization toolbox of a bunch of programs that it was like, okay, this is what you want. It's like the phone tree of like, yes, I have this building. Yes, maybe I'm eligible for this. So I encourage you to reach out to DHCD. Sure, you all have contacts there. If you don't, please let me know. And or just check out their website or point other neighbors to that website. Okay, so conservation districts in Brunswick, in central/western Maryland, we've been working with a group, the city council, I guess I should say most of the city council more so than any group, the city council and residents on a conservation district. So they had an existing National Register district, and they realized that through both deterioration of buildings and some development pressure that they really didn't have a plan for if a major project was going to happen in Brunswick, if developers were coming. They didn't really have anything set in stone. So they had that National Register district, but as I said, it doesn't really have any teeth and it doesn't really give you any guidelines. And so instead of taking that National Register district and then just making a local ordinance on top of that, they decided to do a new process with a lot of community engagement and focus on not just the historic aspects of their structures, but also a bit more about the design, a bit more about the use, and a bit more about like what they were looking for in the future. So from what I understand about the document, it also has review guidelines. So beyond just zoning and scale and mass and things like that, I think there's a bit more in the design guidelines, which I think could be an interesting idea. When you think about Route 1, I think about like low buildings, like, but is that what the future of planning is? I'm not sure. So we brought them on for a webinar. The link right there is a video, a recording of the webinar. They're fantastic people. Listen to that. I think everybody on the call or other neighbors would enjoy hearing that from another kind of community sourced from other neighbors. And so the conservation district, instead of going through the National Register process or creating a local ordinance, it really created a kind of a growth document. Is this another word I can think of for it? So I really think that this is a great case study, obviously a little bit different, but something that I think could be a great resource and kind of get some wheels turning there. So a couple more very simple ones that just is a history. This is a little bit more related to history. Heritage Fund grants, that's through Preservation Maryland. You can use a Heritage Fund grant for acquisition, for interpretation, for preservation planning, for strategic planning, all the way to bricks and mortar projects, to cemetery cleanups, to everything. So if you have people looking for support for a very specific project, as this larger project comes to fruition, please take a look at Heritage Fund. It looks like y'all are not a certified local government. Frankly, I don't know enough about how the government structure and being unincorporated. I leave that up to you, but that does open up a bit more funding. If you do have a historic district commission, or if you don't, the Maryland Association of Historic Districts has a lot of great information about forming concepts of regulating based on historical characteristics, keeping in mind that most historic district commissioners are not preservationists or architects. So it really is good for everybody kind of looking for a primer in that concept. And then I think some of you are involved in the Ellicott City Community Development Corporation feasibility study. And then way more specifically for historical museums or cultural institutions is the Pathways grant from the Maryland Historical Society. So those are all things that came to mind when I was thinking about you all in Elkridge. And of course, our website has a lot of this information. Please sign up for our emails. And then if you have any questions you think can be helpful or make connections or clarify anything, the best email is info, and then I can make sure it gets to the smartest person on staff to help you. But hopefully that's helpful in terms of what programs are available in terms of history and revitalization. And I hope it sparks some good conversations about some programs that might be available to you all.
Thank you, Megan, very much. That was definitely a lot of new information for me, at least. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Laura, I'll send it over to you to see if there were any questions in the chat box that came up that we want to revisit.
Yes, thank you. There were, and thank you. Our speakers are so quick. They are answering a lot of them in the chat box, but it will be nice to kind of summarize. So I guess I'd like to kind of back up to actually while we're on Megan, let's just ask a quick question while your talk is fresh in our mind. And our council member Liz Walsh had a question. I don't know if she wants to ask it or if you'd like me to.
You please, Laura.
Okay. She's wondering, how can we as community members better engage historic-minded experts and advocates in identifying valuable properties along Route 1 that aren't necessarily recognized in a historic district? And your thoughts on that?
Sure. So there was, so nerdy answer first, and then more personal, emotional answer second. There is a state document about modernist architecture and how that is now what preservationists need to be looking at in terms of preservation. So that exists. It's there's a historic context statement all about modernism, of which I think some of Elkridge might fit into. It just seems to me when I was looking at the map that Elkridge is in, it's like just this nestled in this place where you've got Patapsco, you got the state park, and then you have these other kind of larger historic districts, and it's just kind of tucked in the space. And of course, it being so linear is very interesting. So thinking about it, and as a transportation, both in terms of what we learned from Aaron about telegraph and telephone and cars as well. So I think you all pose a challenge to preservationists or historic-minded people to think about it differently. So I think that is part of the challenge. In this case and in others, the framework for preservation isn't always the best framework for a community. So some of these other programs might have that fit of preservation and development that people are looking for more so than a smaller Main Street that's really focusing on their single Main Street businesses. So, I mean, Howard County is, full of preservationists. I think Preservation Maryland in particular, how do we take all those people who care deeply about Ellicott City who, from 2016 on, who from across the country who donated, who texted us all and made sure we were okay and showed concern for us and the buildings. How do we create momentum around that while also differentiating Elkridge from Ellicott City? I think these are all questions. I don't have any answers. I'm sorry, Liz, but certainly open to continue the conversation. I didn't know about the Historic District Commission, I think, or the Historic Preservation Commission, and I don't know how the county overlaps with your town. I I don't live there and I just don't have those details, but that's something that I would be really interested in learning more about. Are there initiatives that the HPC can work on that are focused on Elkridge? So definitely there's a preservation aspect to these questions. But I think just need a bit, there's not going to be a preservation answer because of the challenges of the shape, size, age, and diversity of Elkridge.
Okay, thanks. And I think a lot of the grants and things, and we also want to think about our neighbors down in the southern end of the county, in the Savage and Jessup area, like as Brian had mentioned in the chat. So I think a lot of those will be informative and can also be applicable to them and their development in the south part of Route 1. I do want to go back to Lisa, who was definitely answering a lot in the chat. Maybe you can give a little summary about kind of the questions being asked in terms of just advocacy and what you think the priorities should be. And then it looks like you do have a question for Mike Smith. Oh, I think you're still on mute.
I am, thank you, sorry. So some of the questions that I saw that I tried to answer and listen to Megan's great talk at the same time a little bit was a question about how do we advocate in the upcoming general plan update for things that would specifically help the revitalization plans for Route 1. And I had mentioned about the development assessment project that happened with the Clarion consultants and a lot of really great advice that they had at the time. I noticed a crossover with some of their advice and the Route 1 master plan with regard to character zoning, neighborhood compatibility issues, trying to have diversity of types of land use, but also recognize that there's character along Route 1 and history and architecture and things that we want to preserve and not just have all cookie cutter developments down Route 1 with max density. But we you know, Mr. Smith brought up these excellent issues of walkability and getting away from cars and all of the pandemic concerns that for health and safety that are going to have long issues into the future for land use and comfortable people's comfort. And so I got to thinking that one of the things that we've relied upon for years in zoning with where do we put high density zoning so that it's actually considered smart growth, and that is put it near public transit. And we've relied on that. But fear of public transit is yet another in the list of long-term changes with people's comfort levels and what they're going to be choosing to do. And so we, you know, when we define walkability, we can't just define walkability as living near public transit anymore. My question then becomes, how do we create walkability that's not just walkability to public transit? And how do we have communities that have a lot of diverse amenities that you can actually get to and make them part of interesting community interaction areas that we can't just rely on public transportation to hop on and make us use cars less than as much as before. So thank you.
Yeah, we don't have metro here, so we don't have something from an infrastructure standpoint that other communities near us enjoy, and where you can cluster development and get scale of development and sort of a cohabitating series of uses that kind of live off, breathe off each other and feed each other regularly throughout the whole life cycle of a day, so that things don't go dark in the morning or at night, they stay active. There are people hustling and bustling around, and the beauty of, you know, all the different development elements I shared earlier is that they kind of work nicely with each other. The challenge I see for us is that we don't have that transportation infrastructure, heavy rail. We certainly have the commuter rail system, and if that could evolve perhaps to something that's more commuter-like, instead of just being a shared line that deals with freight as a priority, but has passenger service as an equal priority, or something that has a greater priority than enjoys today, you might be able to start building these nodes where you can sort of cluster the development and make some of these themes happen. But what we're left with is sort of residential that's working right now and industrial as a broad category. And those to me are the two most dissonant land uses you could try to cohabitate because they just don't really play well with each other in the sandbox of life. They're very distinct, different. It's hard to build a community around those two uses. So we really need to get back to a safer world so that we can embrace some of that retail, restaurant, placemaking stuff that really is the jello, the glue that kind of makes place happen. That's the challenge. And, you know, I'm all about solving the virus and getting back to a different version of our world than we're in now. I'm not a scientist, but we need to help, you know, elevate and enhance our path back to that degree of safety as quickly as we can so that we can embrace some of these concepts. The other thing I would really strongly recommend is we're looking at our general plan to try and create incentives in the planning process to create the kinds of communities we all want to be part of. So use our zoning tools as really incentivizers to encourage the developers, both for-profit, nonprofit, to embrace the kind of communities that you all want to see happen. And there are a lot of ways you can do that. It's not just providing cash, grant money. That's just not something anybody does. But there are certainly ways we can, I think, incent the zoning code to create the spaces we want to embrace. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we also have a question from Mary Barr. She's on the phone. Would you like to ask your question, Mary?
Yes, I would. Thank you. This is not necessarily a question, but it's thoughts about land use along Route 1. And you were addressing this to Mike, more or less, that you were talking about necessary for diversity and residential property and et cetera, et cetera. And there's nothing, and I'm speaking of Elkridge particularly, nobody else, because Elkridge is divided by the railroad. CSX is definitely a freight train. It's for freight. It's not for passenger. But I'm thinking about historically how we've looked at Elkridge in the past, and it's been a train town. It's been a B&O town. The housing is very low. It was for the B&O workers to live in, very poor people. And then there's the other thing, which was very popular, that made Elkridge popular for many, many, many years, and it's been written about, and it's known up and down the East Coast, is the motels. And I'm just thinking about the use and the keeping of historic motels, the historic buildings that could be a motel area that would keep that, I don't know, let's see, what is it, flavor or not flavor, but the idea that motels served a purpose and they can still serve a purpose, and they can be redone, they can be upgraded or whatever to be, to be more useful to various kinds of people instead of being used for human trafficking and prostitution, which is what they're used for now a lot. But I've read from Hank Stuver, who wrote about that, who wrote about the motels, who writes about structures that are no longer being used and they're just tossed aside. And so the historic use of motels, and for instance, the movie theater, the outdoor movie theater that was torn down, which is really, to me, a shame, because there's no cultural place for people to go. And though it is in use for cars, at least the people are safe in their own cars. They don't mix in a theater. I would think something like that could be built, to keep the history of Elkridge, not as a big urban area, not as a big city, but a community that works together, a community that everybody is welcome. And even the drive-in restaurants where you were served, by somebody on roller skates. I mean, this is all safe kind of interaction for retail. And it also keeps that history of Elkridge alive. It's the little things sometimes that add up, and the creativity that you use these buildings that are still in existence on Route 1, keep them active in the right way. I mean, I've often thought, Daniel's Bar, for instance, where it has motorcycle guys come in all the time. I mean, that's a very interesting idea, but the place being historic, it goes all the way back to the turn of the century. could be updated, could be painted, could be welcoming from the outside and kept in shape by the owners, so that it maintains that history, but is more usable, more flexible, and more welcoming to various people. All these little things, all these details, I wonder why developers haven't looked at the history and the use of Elkridge, downtown Elkridge, historically, and kept that flavor, that those good images of potential alive and vibrant and welcoming is a what do you call it? I can't think of the name, but something that tourists can go to. Somebody traveling through can stop and say, oh, we stopped at Elkridge and had a great motel, we had a great sleep, et cetera, and we went to a drive-in or went to a bar. And, keeping a really nice idea going like that.
Yes,
So anyway.
I agree,
that's
Mary,
my-
and I would like to direct that question to Mike, because also it is challenging for those of us who do live in this area who want to advocate. We kind of feel like we're at a difference. Like we definitely look different than the rest of the county, where development looks different, it feels different, and our development that we get is very stark differences. But yet we do want to treasure our historic. So what are your advice for how do we what are the things we need to say, or what are the things we need to do to kind of get that type of feel?
I'm a Route 1 kid. I grew up in a small town north of Boston, Danvers, Massachusetts. Route 1 runs through my town. It runs all the way up to Maine. It runs all the way down to Florida. What I'd love to do, what I'd encourage people to do, is to take a look at the entirety of the Route 1 expanse from Florida to Maine and start looking at places that are like us in Elkridge, where we have sort of evolved with that motel, hotel, sort of industrial, truck-driven kind of land use footprint, places that are in close proximity to major metropolitan communities like the city of Baltimore, the city of Washington, D.C., to see how those places evolved and to see if there's some lessons we can draw from the experiences of the development evolution in those places, such that they still embrace some of the key elements that Mary just talked about that have gone in directions we're not entirely comfortable with, the motel footprint particularly, but there's a story there that we still want to embrace, we still want to preserve in some form, maybe with some of the tools that Megan spent a lot of time talking about tonight, and others can, articulate how we can use those tools, but there might be ways to evolve those footprints in a more contemporary form that embraces the proximity we enjoy to two major metropolitan areas. I spent a part of yesterday on another Zoom call, and it was all about the Baltimore market and the DC market. Transwestern did the call, and the markets are booming residentially in both places. I mean, we're on the national sort of level of performance, from occupancy, from rental rates, from all kind of statistics that folks who develop apartments pay attention to. And it just tells me the energy is there. We're kind of bookended by two pretty good stories. And how can we sort of evolve and sort of take some of the energy from those good stories and create a better sense of place than we enjoy today? Sorry, that's a long answer, but.
I just have an anecdote. When I was living in DC and now I'm in Baltimore, the markets you're talking about, and I can't figure out how to get to the Guinness Brewery by any way other than driving. So, if creating, especially now in COVID, getting together with friends to hike or bike or walk, I mean, that's a built-in day trip to Patapsco, to Guinness, and to stay at a tourist motel. So I can't help but also strikingly in all three sessions, there are some real big issues here beyond development. I mean, and I'm a preservation, I don't know much about human trafficking. I don't know much about other things, but it seems to me that there is a lot of groundwork to get to the point where there's going to be I'm not trying to be negative. I'm actually incredibly saddened. I'm glad that everybody's talking about it. I know that it's a part of your potentially like everyday lives, which I think is really sad. And I just wonder if there's ways that these discussions can also begin to address some of those. I mean, of course, in terms of, I just can't help but just be a human and say it's just so sad. In the past 3 calls chatting with you all has been about that. And I wonder what resources people are looking to that are, I don't know if there are any place-based tools to address that as we also look at kind of these other concepts, so yes, wouldn't it be great if that my friends and I could get to Patapsco and Guinness, but it seems like one of the ways to the concepts of the hotels or the restaurants or whatever, the longevity of the small businesses, it's the capacity and the business health of these small businesses, and personal experiences, and the quality of life of the residents.
Well, I look at the Route 95 experience, Megan, versus the Route 1 experience. And Route 1 predates 95. Route 95 is a suburban, demographically driven in a very different place than Route 1's been driven historically. And the challenge that Elkridge faces and Savage, other places that align Route 1, are very similar to the challenges that exist around many other cities that have Route 1 going through them. And they have found ways, and I can't think of examples, and I'd like to start thinking about this a bit, where the evolution has happened in ways that embrace the principles we're talking about tonight, but help evolve that footprint in a different way. When you think about Route 1, back in the day, it was a stop and go environment to move, and that was the way I used to drive. My parents drove around. You didn't get very far before you hit a stoplight, so you had another experience at every stoplight. And the culture of Route 95, which is high speed and not really engaging, and the exits are a mile or more apart, we have to embrace something that's slower, more neighborhood oriented, and that's really what Route 1 is about. And to sort of rethink how that life experience is so different than the 95 experience, where all the investment, all the capital in the world has been flowing to 95. But look at what we have left behind. We still have a spine, if you will, that connects all these states, all these communities together. It's like the Route 66 story out west, which is embraced as an historic place. I think we just need to elevate what Route 1 is about, what it's meant to the history of this country and the evolution of where we are today. We wouldn't be where we are without Route 1.
Yeah, thank you. I agree, and I feel like sometimes it's hard to find the dollar, flip the dollar, to have the focus be on the redevelopment versus development. And I think that's where sometimes we kind of get stuck in our area, because what do we do with, we're the past, we've been grandfathered into these things, and we're a challenge and we're a conundrum. So it's too hard to
Laura, I want to just add real quickly, Laura, that we've run out of places to put money on 95. The world right now is looking for new space, and the new spaces are the old spaces. The places that the last 2 or 3 economic cycles have passed by are now the last places left where you can invest capital and really evolve it in a different direction and get a return on investment. So I think this is a great time to talk about Route 1. We're now living in a digital world. We're embracing each other in a very different way. Digital farms, solar farms, there are a lot of new things that are on the table that weren't there 5 and 10 years ago. And I think the world's going in a different direction. And we just have to figure out how to align Elkridge and Route 1 with that world. That's our challenge.
Yes, thank you. And that definitely uplifts me. And because you're right. And that is going to be my new spin. To wrap things up, I do just want to reach out to John Fisher, who had just asked because he's a single parent and trying to be an advocate, can't always find, how does this someone on a community citizen level who feels they're busy, but they want to develop, and especially those, with families who might be finding it hard to balance and juggle it all, but yet make an impact. And maybe Lisa, because you are a leader in the community advocacy, maybe you have any final words of wisdom for those of us who are really trying our best, but we struggle. I think you're on mute again.
I get asked that question a lot. Thank you. And I think that people who want to be involved in a general way is maybe different than people who want to advocate for something that is going on in their immediate neighborhood and environment. And how do I look at a project that is going to be near me, and have some input into it and get some compromises if I've got concerns or something. And in both areas, it's pretty much the same thing. If there's a specific project that you want to have your input make the most impact, you've got to start as soon as possible. Because once development plans have progressed, and have gone forward for years, like I said, how long their process is at DPZ, they've gone through a lot of the process at DPZ. They've spent a lot of money making the plans the way they need to be, and altering them last minute is very expensive. There are issues with funding and milestones to hit with the process, and it's just much harder. They're not going to be as willing to maybe incorporate some ideas about how to address concerns late in the process. So you have to kind of understand when those processes begin. And the way to do that is to get onto the list for pre-submission community hearings, because all projects start with a pre-submission, meaning before they submit their plans to the county, they have a community meeting and they try to get input into any types of issues that people have questions or concerns about with a project right from the get-go. And then that's when you maybe can have a little bit more ability and flexibility with the development plans. And then of course, trying to follow that through the process, like if there's a request for a regulation change, if there's a request for a waiver or certain alternate thing for that project, they would have hearings, or not. So, there's council schedules, there's zoning board schedules, planning board schedules. So it's complicated. When we started the People's Voice, that was our biggest goal, was to kind of try to have a one-stop place where I just had all these schedules listed and you could kind of go in and see them all in one place. That's part of the civic work that we do, because this is such a common question. So that's the best answer I can come up with right now.
All right, thank you very much. I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up now. So I just wanted to again thank all of our presenters and those audience members sticking with us past our hour time slot. We always seem to go over a bit, but hopefully not too long. And it was certainly educational and a lot of good information tonight. So thank you all very much.